Hey, I'm Cato Gashoro, and welcome to Let It Rip. We're coming to you from the CUNY TV studios in the shadow of the Empire State Building in New York City. Now, as the presidential campaign heats up, polling numbers suggest that the vast majority of voters are unenthusiastic regarding a rematch between Donald Trump and President Joe Biden. Given the fact that Donald Trump is the first former president in U.S. history to face criminal charges, one would think that this would be a slam dunk for President Biden. But several indicators reveal this will be an uphill battle for the Biden-Harris ticket, with the current state of the economy being one of the biggest concerns for most Americans. While President Biden and other top Democratic officials continue reeling off statistics about low unemployment and declining inflation, the evidence of a strong economy has yet to translate into greater support given his low approval rating, which is a dismal 35%. While the stock market recently reached an all-time high, that hasn't changed the reality for 44 million people who are struggling with food insecurity. Nearly 38 million people are in poverty and 26 million don't have health insurance. So it's not surprising, as reported by Fortune magazine, that the wealth gap is getting worse with rich white people getting even richer. In fact, according to CNBC, the racial wage gap starts as early as 16 years of age for black workers, which is an early indicator of limited opportunities that limit one's lifetime earnings. For example, despite black women being touted as the most educated group in the United States, they make only 69 cents of every dollar a white man makes and carry the most student loan debt. So while Donald Trump has said,
nobody has done more for the black community than Donald Trump,
and Joe Biden has said,
if you have a problem figuring out whether you're for me or Trump, and you ain't black.
We wanted to assemble a great panel to discuss the impact pay disparities and the racial wealth gap will have on the 2024 presidential elections. Here to help us discuss these issues in New York City is Councilmember Althea Stevens, Vice President of Government Relations for the Parkside Group, Kalima Johnson, and New York State Senator Jabari Brisport. I'm Cato Gashoro, and this is Let It Rip. Councilmember, I'll start with you. I know recently you had a resolution passed that declared February 15th as Black Girls Magic Day in New York City. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so last year, actually, in February, we passed the resolution, which was called Black Girl Magic Day, that would pretty much celebrate Black women across the city for their accomplishments and their achievements. And, you know, so many Black women often don't feel seen or heard or don't feel celebrated. And I was really excited to be able to bring this to light. And so this year was our first ever celebration in City Council chambers where we honored women across the city, women who typically are just doing the work and no one's ever appreciating them, and really honored them and had a celebration, have folks who often don't feel like they have a seat at the table, know that we're here and we're ready and we're doing the work, but let's recognize you for the work that you're doing.
And you know, I think a lot of women across the city appreciate you for that. But what else do you think that folks should be doing in addition to not just recognizing Black women, but also addressing some of the substantive issues that they confront on a daily basis? What would be some of your recommendations?
I mean, some of the things that I've made a priority since I've gotten to council is when you think about Just Pay. So that's a campaign that I've been working on for the last 2 years, and even before I got in council, because I come from the nonprofit sector. And in the nonprofit sector, you have the most educated women in New York City working, but they are underpaid. And a lot of these are from contracts that the city are contracting with nonprofits. And so for me, it's really thinking about how are we making sure that people who are doing the work in our communities, right? When you think about when you're at your most vulnerable state, 90% of the times you are starting at a nonprofit that is really there to give you services, to support families. They helping folks with advocacy and landlord, but they're not able to pay their staff a livable wage. And to me, that is just really unacceptable. And often what's happening is we'll have folks who are working in these programs, not because of anything other than they want to help their community. But you have to choose, if I want to help my community and help folks and have a livable wage. And when we were looking through a lot of the evidence and things like that, a lot of them are receiving some of the services that they're helping their clients with, which to me is really unacceptable. And we as a city and a state have to do better about serving our folks who are in the nonprofit sector.
Great. Jabari, I know there's been a lot of pushing to make sure that folks, across the state are getting a just wage, a living wage. What are your thoughts on some of the things that Althea just said?
I mean, you got to pay people, and there is just mass disrespect in terms of low wages across sectors that are dominated by women. The service sector, nurses, childcare workers. Your typical childcare worker makes $30,000 to $35,000 a year, which is would not be the case if it was a sector dominated by men. So we need to call it out for what it is. So we really need to push. We've done a few things. We've done the Fair Pay for Home Care campaign to get their wages up to we were pushing for $22.50. Childcare workers were pushing for a living wage equivalent to educators, and across the sector, fighting for better wages for these working class women and women of color.
Right. So what are your thoughts on linking what folks are making now to inflation? So making sure that at least their wages are going up, particularly in times when inflation is high, because what you're seeing is that even though wages are going up, it's not tracking with the inflation. What are your thoughts?
I think absolutely, because there is one group whose wages went with inflation. That was the corporate sector.
Right.
Corporate profits spiked alongside people seeing the cost of eggs and everything going up at the supermarket. But I think for working class people, they should see their wages go up with inflation as well.
So there's a report by the Kansas City Fed that said, look, corporate profits are actually the ones that are causing the inflation. Have there been any efforts on your end to try and combat that?
Yeah, we've launched a large Tax the Rich campaign at the state level, which taxes a variety of things, whether the income on millionaires and billionaires, the actual assets of them, but also corporate profits, raising the corporate tax rate to ensure that those gains that they've been taking from working class come back to the working class.
All right. Kalima, what are your thoughts?
First, I think as we think about equity and we talk about raising minimum wage, that is a way to address the problem. However, we are talking about the gap between Black women, white women, Asian women, and white men. So like if we raise the wage for everyone, how are we still addressing that equity gap? So for me, it's about being more strategic in our approach, right? Like how do we encourage corporations? How do we encourage government folks, nonprofit providers to strategically address the gap? Because the wage raises everyone.
Right. So Kalima raises a great point, this idea of equity, right? Because even as we're talking about increasing wages across sectors, you still have some people who are doing better off than others. How then would you as legislators be able to tackle that? Althea?
I mean, and when we're talking about inequities, I think there's a couple of things we need to talk about. And the elephant in the room is reparations, right? Like, I'm a big believer of we need to be thinking about what does that look like, not only just on a monetary level, but when we're thinking about on a living level. I was just in Albany, we were doing a workshop talking about housing, right? We know that a lot of times a pathway to generational wealth is ownership. In New York City, we don't have that, right? We are always talking about affordable housing and how do we make sure that there's apartments, but we're not talking about home ownership. And so thinking about as we are doing our reparation studies, I know the governor signed some stuff into law last year, and I know the city council, we have some bills around reparations, but those are things that need to be part of the conversation. How are we looking at long-term things to infuse to make sure that, yes, we need capital. We need to be looking at the housing market. How are we making sure that people have homes and have paths to generational wealth? What are we doing around economic development in specific communities? And how do we make sure that those programs are targeting folks who are consistently left out of these conversations? I think is going to be really important. And part of that is thinking about a true reformative package around reparations to address some of these gaps that won't be addressed by, like Kalima just said, by raising the minimum wage or, taxing the rich. Those are things that should be happening, right? For me, that's a baseline. But we should be thinking about how are we making sure we're getting what we're owed. So
coming back to you, with regard to generational wealth and thinking about how reparations could have a great impact on how folks are struggling, what are your thoughts on the state bill that just passed in terms of studying reparations and coming up with a way to, I guess, engage in a sort of redistribution of wealth?
Yeah, so first, I think the state bill is just amazing and a huge step in the right direction. I'm curious and excited to see when the money gets to the hands of Black folks who are owed. Secondly, I do think it is always a strategic approach to have as many community members. That's a part of making decisions and providing recommendations. But I think the state bill is a step in the right direction.
I know you sponsored the state bill in the Senate, at the Senate level. What are your thoughts in terms of having community members be actively engaged in this conversation and making sure that they're actively being, whatever recommendations they're making, are actually being taken in and being acted on?
Yeah, I'm a big proponent of a community-led process. In fact, the bill that passed was not my original bill. My bill got watered down, but the original bill had the commission be dominated by community members, some of the groups that have been working on reparations for decades, the December 12th movement, in COBRA, the Institute for the Black World. This current one is stacked by appointments from the governor, the Speaker of the Assembly, and the majority leader of the Senate. But it's really important, like Kaleema was saying, that community members are doing the work, because the same state that imprisoned and also enslaved and harmed Black people, which cannot be the same state that also gives them their liberation. It needs to be the people that are doing the work.
You all raise important issues, but when you look at what the president is doing, there's a lot of aid going to Ukraine. There's a lot of aid going to Israel with regard to its conflict with the Palestinians. But none of that money seems to trickle down to the folks domestically who need it the most. What are your thoughts on that?
We deserve better options than Biden and Trump on the ballot in November. I'm just going to flat out say that, and I've been very disappointed with the Biden administration, especially on Palestine in recent months. But I do think that if we raise our voices enough, we can force them to side more with what everyday working class people are saying that they're demanding for.
Mm-hmm. And Councilmember, thoughts?
I think, and I think for me, it's like looking at the whole totality, right? Like, and understanding how government works. And I think sometimes people have like misplacements of these things. And so a lot of times they look to the federal government for like, oh, they should be doing these things. But the reality is a lot of these things do fall on the state and local government. When I was growing up, I learned my politics and government from my family. We would have discussions and talk about it. That's not happening anymore. And thinking about how are we building out the Black family unit so we can bring these be a part of the conversation.
Kaleema, what are your thoughts?
We have elected officials that we can actually grab. We can go to City Hall. We can go up to the state capitol. So I would just want to revert the attention to say what's happening federally is important, what's happening globally is important. But for me, our everyday life is really impacted by the folks that we're sitting here. So for me, it's we should be turning out every election, but especially more than ever locally.
Okay, great points. So great discussion, but we'll have to end it there. When we come back, we'll further discuss the racial wealth gap and some possible solutions to bridge that gap with New York City Comptroller Brad Lander. I'm Kerry Gashuro, and this is Let It Rip. Welcome back. I'm Kerry Gashuro, and this is Let It Rip. Now, according to a recent report from the New York Federal Reserve Bank, the real net worth of white individuals outgrew that of Black and Hispanic individuals by 30 percentage points, and 9 percentage points from the first quarter of 2019 through the second quarter of 2023. This period featured a remarkable level of government support and aid to financial markets. The Federal Reserve essentially bailed out the investor class by pumping trillions of dollars in the markets and dramatically cutting interest rates. Now, due to discrimination by major lending institutions, the pandemic housing boom left Black home buyers behind. This resulted in the Black-white home ownership gap growing to its widest in a decade. Institutions like Wells Fargo literally rejected nearly half of their Black homeowners' refinancing applications. So here to help us discuss the racial wealth gap and pay disparities facing people of color is New York City Comptroller Brad Lander. Thank you for joining us, Comptroller. Glad to have you here.
Great to be with you.
One of the things that we saw during the subprime lending crisis is that nobody was held accountable.
Yep.
Then we come into the Wells Fargo debacle in terms of discrimination, and you also don't see anybody being held accountable for that. And so a lot of folks are feeling like, well, if corporations can get away with all this, what chance does a little person have when they're simply trying to make a way out of no way?
Yeah. I mean, I'm with you. I voted against Wells Fargo being designated as a city depository just to do some of the city's banking last year for exactly these reasons. People are not held to the standards, that you would expect in Community Reinvestment Act. So I'm sympathetic, and we got to keep pushing for, stronger legislation, for more opportunities, and really measuring.
There was an op-ed last year that the mayor was doing a fantastic job with the MWBEs, but you recently released a report indicating that there hasn't been as much progress as folks were hoping to see. I was hoping you could talk a little bit about that.
Yes, look, I know the mayor's working hard, and Michael Garner, who's the chief business diversity officer, is working really hard. But if the question is, what do the numbers say? Unfortunately, the numbers continue to say that blacks, Hispanics, and women of color get a tiny share of the city's procurement, $40 billion of procurement last year.
Right.
Only $10 billion of it even covered by MWBE goals. And of that $10 billion, 1.16% to black-owned MWBEs, 0.996% to Hispanic MWBEs, and 1.03% to all women of color combined.
So when you talk about, and I think your report pointed this out, the disparity within the disparity.
Yeah.
What is the best way to address that to make sure that at least black women and Hispanic women are also seeing significant contracts coming their way?
Yeah, I mean, so first, agencies have to be held accountable for the goals, for the disparity within the disparity, not just their overall MWBE number. How are they doing with women of color, with blacks, with Hispanics, as well as Asian men and white women and MWBEs overall? A lot of ways to do that. You can better match what agencies are looking for with what those MWBEs are selling. There's a real room to focus on and improve subcontracting.
Right. Okay. And so Wall Street is doing phenomenally well, but common folks are still struggling to pay, basic goods and services. But it seems that the government, or at least the federal government, has significant money to give to, or at least in some way, rebates to Wall Street or private companies. Why is this the case, and why haven't we seen more aid going towards working people?
Absolutely, and we got some data today on child poverty in New York City, which is now 1 in 4 kids. And what was especially tragic is during the pandemic, it actually went down.
Exactly.
We had a crisis. It wiped out our economy. But because the government stepped up with things like the child tax credit, child poverty actually went down by 30%.
Right.
But because the MAGA GOP folks in Congress wouldn't agree to keep it, it got cut. Pandemic aid disappeared. Child tax credit expired. And now working families are struggling and poverty is up.
But is it fair to blame all this on the MAGA Republicans? Because
the child tax credit expiration, yes, right. That's not everything.
Right,
but that's a pretty big one.
Right, but in terms of the other stuff, we can say that the president had the opportunity to actually negotiate some of those provisions early in his presidency, particularly the first 2 years before they had the turnover in Congress. And, we lost a couple of seats in New York State.
Absolutely.
So why not tell, or rather, why is the administration sort of slow to see these things, particularly from a strategic standpoint, to say, we know what may be coming down the pike. Why don't we do these things now?
And look, what was stripped out of Build Back Better, especially those investments in affordable housing and in the care economy to expand child care and home care and lift wages for child care and home care workers, who are a lot of struggling, mostly women of color in New York City and all around the country. If they had kept those in Build Back Better, people would be thriving. So yes, do I wish the president would be willing to say, if I get a second term, I'm going to do the child care and the home care. I'm going to do the affordable housing. Right. That's what we need to be focused on.
So when we look at some of the things that you said that are contributing to folks not being able to, in fact, folks struggling just to make ends meet, can we really expect the Biden administration to do anything with regard to the racial wealth gap if people are already struggling to meet basic goods and services?
Well, look, this is what politics is for, is to make those demands. The biggest place that people have their wealth in this country is in their homes. Right. Could we put a big focus on Black and Latino home ownership? Of course we could. Could we in New York City reboot the old Mitchell-Lama program so working class families have an opportunity to buy a co-op, like a Co-op City or Penn South or Amalgamated Houses, first rung on that wealth building ladder? Could we reduce student debt, which disproportionately hits students of color rather than white students? Of course we could. So there are real steps that the city, the state, and absolutely the federal government could take. I'd like to hear more about it in the campaign for sure.
Right. So even when we speak about that, one of the things that emerged from the pandemic is that black folks were routinely discriminated against, particularly when it comes to housing applications. How do you think about the mayor's city of Yes, which is talking about adding approximately 500,000 units of affordable housing in the next decade?
I wish it were affordable. 500,000 units of total housing, with
Right.
some of it affordable.
But yeah, so and I think that's part of the challenge for most people is to say, look, you're talking about affordability. Even what is characterized as affordable now is not affordable.
Yeah.
Is that something that you've looked at and said?
Absolutely.
You haven't
Look,
even given us the details about what
well,
affordability is going to look
we don't
like.
have all the City of Yes details, so I can't give
Yeah,
you,
no,
yet,
you're
but,
absolutely right.
Look, we do need more housing at all income levels. Because some of this is supply and demand in the market. So we need more housing overall. But we've got to have a big focus on affordability and make sure our tax breaks and our subsidies and the biggest density bonuses are going for genuinely affordable housing, and that's got to be at incomes, at rents that people can really pay who are struggling. But I'm going to add this next point. You need to protect tenants from getting evicted, because when the rent's too high, people get thrown out. That's why I support good cause eviction protections in Albany. But the item I want to add, and sometimes people call this social housing, but what I like to say is Mitchell-Lama was the best housing program New York ever had. Over 90% of those Mitchell-Lama co-ops are still affordable co-ops today. We could build a new generation of those in brand new multifamily buildings that create an affordable cooperative homeownership opportunity. So you buy a co-op for, let's say $200,000, and then you stay there and it goes up a little bit each year. You can't sell it for $2 million because you're going to sell it to another family that's affordable, but maybe it goes from $200,000 to $300,000 over 10 years, and you've had an affordable place to live, and you're able to build up a little nest egg so you could send your kid to college or get ready to retire.
You conducted a study with regard to reparations, and your study revealed that it might be able to address some of, at least bridge the gap somewhat. Talk a little bit about
So first,
that.
I just want to say how bad the numbers are, because I think people know that the income gap. We're approaching equal pay day, and women are only paid 85 cents on the dollar. The black-white wealth gap in New York is staggering. So the median white New York household has a median net worth of $277,000, 15 times the median net worth of a black household in New York,
no
which
surprises
is only
there.
$18,000.
Right.
I mean, I knew it would be bad, but still 15 times.
Right.
And while $277,000 is enough to, give your kid some money for a down payment, $18,000 is not enough to survive a medical emergency in many cases.
Even a car emergency. In some instances.
Or to start that business that's going to be able to get the MWBE contract, because you just don't have enough capital to get started. So yes, what we looked at was how could you take policies inspired by the reparations movement that would make a real difference? And those, I think, would be things like the kind of homeownership programs that we're talking about. You got to give people access to that ladder. Or some capital to start a business that could then get city contracts. So we need to really focus. I don't think it'll just be a broad program that kind of gives everybody some money. It would be, how do we invest in wealth building opportunities for black and other families that have been locked out of opportunities on ways that really build that ladder.
Right. But in your report, I don't know if you indicated whether we should understand reparations as a debt owed to black folks, as opposed to the idea that they're just black citizens of the United States.
Well, I like the way that Heather McGhee talks about it in her book, The Sum of Us, because, we got to deal with the legacy of discrimination. It is really there, and obviously, especially for American descendants of slaves, you can see the legacy, and that's why we have this wealth gap. At the same time, the data is clear that if we can bring more people in so that they could start businesses and be homeowners, then everyone, including white folks and everybody else, would see what she calls a solidarity dividend as our economy's more thriving, our neighborhoods are safer, trust goes up. So it's not either or, it's both a debt paid and an opportunity for all of us.
This was a great discussion, but we'll have to end it there. I want to thank the New York City Comptroller, Brad Lander, for joining us. Stay tuned, and when we come back, I will share some final thoughts on the attack on DEI. I'm Kero Gashuro, and this is Let It Rip. And now for our concluding thoughts. In the wake of George Floyd's murder and protests following his killing, many companies pledged to make their workplaces more inclusive of Black employees. However, after the Supreme Court's recent decision to end affirmative action in higher education, diversity, equity, and inclusion programs have come under increasing attacks from the right wing, who see DEI programs as discriminating against prospective white employees. For example, Bill Ackman, whose criticism of Claudine Gay led to her resignation as Harvard University's president, claimed, and I quote, that DEI is racist because reverse racism is racism, even if it's against white people. Such views are not just false, but have had a chilling effect on companies that have DEI programs where they are now reevaluating or banning them altogether. The assault on DEI initiatives also represents the gradual dismantling of gains that Black folks mobilized and organized in a bid to make this country more equitable. The attacks on DEI initiatives, affirmative action, and voting rights not only call into question whether this country is really committed to being a true democracy, but they also serve as a reminder that folks will have to continue fighting to make and maintain the progress they have made, no matter how big or small. I'm Kero Gashuro, and this is Let It Rip.